This video is brought to you by the University Writing Center, a unit of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. You can contact us at uwc.utexas.edu.
So today we will be talking about writing the dissertation, some strategies and things to think about as you develop professional writing habits. So we will talk about common challenges for graduate writers, some ideas on how to meet those challenges, thinking about how you might assess how you're using your time as a way to then think about scheduling time or using time in a different way. Which leads into the next point, categorizing your task and strategizing the use of your time. And then lastly, creating a daily writing routine. All right, so one of the biggest challenges of writing the dissertation, of course, is that it's a large project. It's typically longer than anything you've ever written before, and it's going to take more time than anything you've ever written before, several years. By some fault of my own, it took me about 5 years to write my dissertation. Many stops and starts and reinventions and changed advisors, and it was a long process. These projects are large and long-term, so they can feel daunting. You know, how do I get started? How do I make progress on this? And then when after a certain amount of time, when some of the anxiety might be wearing off, it might start to feel a little bit tedious, especially if you keep submitting drafts to advisors and they keep coming back, or there are more publications that you then have to contend with, and the chapters evolve and they change, and that is part of the process. We talked a little bit about this last week. Most graduate students have never read a dissertation before. So you're being asked to write something that you've never written, but then also never read. And so it feels many times like wading into unknown territory. And then lastly, the panic mode or last minute writing that may have worked for undergrad, it probably worked. And then even sometimes for grad seminar papers is almost always unsustainable. So there's something to be said for panic mode. You know, you have a very clear deadline. You don't have a lot of time for doubt or for negotiating that time that you spend on the writing. And usually the writing gets done. You will wear yourself out doing that if you try to write chapters in the dissertation that way. So what do we do about it? Oh, sorry. Of course, and this is probably obvious to most of you, we want to start by breaking the dissertation into several smaller projects and really thinking of them as smaller, more discrete projects. So like the literature review, or really unpacking your research questions, or the methods section of your dissertation, to make them concrete and finishable projects that then are assembled into the complete work. By the same logic, break each dissertation chapter into several sections and set goals that are specific and time bound. So like if you know that you have to grapple with certain scholars or map out the conversation around this particular question, you can be like, okay, this week I'm going to read these 3 articles in this, skim this book, and then I'm going to write these 4 pages that are going to make up that section. And again, when that task is completed, that is really good to boost your morale and to build and sustain that momentum. Another big one is to start where you can, which is not necessarily at the beginning. I don't think I've ever worked with a graduate writer who wrote the introduction first. That typically is oftentimes the last bit of the dissertation to be written. Because again, like I said, your thinking changes, it evolves, it grows, the project itself changes oftentimes, like as you are working on the chapters or doing additional research or additional field work. And then also, you know, something that can be helpful is if you are just feeling unmotivated and unsure of yourself, I always recommend to writers to go to a section or a place or even just an idea where you feel excited or you feel like you have something to say. And then starting there. And so like if you're doing a literature dissertation, you might go to a close reading of a poem and get a couple pages of close reading, and really again just to start to build that momentum. So go to what you know, to what you feel comfortable with, to what you feel excited about, and then you can start building from that core idea or that core commitment. Writing quickly and editing slowly is something that probably a lot of people hear, and it again tends to be effective. And so what does that mean? The most significant thing is to try not to edit as you're writing. And as someone who personally, I did this all the time. Like I was the perfectionist at the sentence level. Like I didn't want to move on until that sentence was as good as it could get. And I eventually got pages and chapters done, but it was a pretty arduous process. It could be very demoralizing to spend a day of writing or like 8 hours of writing and only come away with like a paragraph or two. So that was part of my process. What generally works for a lot of people is to write quickly, get the ideas down, start writing in consecutive sentences, moving towards those points of insight, and then maybe in a separate later session, so do that work, take a break, rest your mind, rest your body, and then come back to it and then start editing slowly. And then that's where you can make those smaller adjustments and find the language choices that you feel most comfortable or most proud of, and really kind of crystallizing or putting together those ideas. People have their own way of doing this. Experimenting is part of this process as well. And then lastly on this slide, finding examples in your field. We talked about this last week, and this helps address that point, that you're being asked to write something that you've never read before. Try go reading some things. The UT library has most graduate dissertations. Some of them are embargoed, meaning that they're inaccessible for a certain set amount of time, usually for people who want to publish that material and don't want too much of it out in the world. But there are plenty of dissertations that you can go take a look at, and I encourage you to do that. And when I say take a look, I really mean take a look, skim strategically. There's really no reason, unless you want to and you have the time to do it, but probably most of us don't, to read cover to cover, but to look at, how this thing has been put together. How many chapters does it have? How many pages does each chapter have? How have they structured the introduction? Where does the literature review come? Where do they include their data set? How are they formatting their tables? Things like that. Just to give you a sense of some of the conventions and styles and kind of just like the compositional structure of dissertations that have been passed, because if they're in the library, they passed, right? Okay, so those are some of the things that we can do to help manage these large projects. This one, of course, juggling multiple time commitments. So the question at the bottom of the slide is, which of these are the things that you need to do? So original research, spend time with friends and family, get articles published, read journals in the field, write a dissertation. It's a trick question, of course, because you are being asked and need to do all of these things. And very deliberately, we included in this list your life, mental, physical wellness, like sleeping, in addition to fulfilling the requirements of your program and credentialing yourself as a young, junior scholar, like going to academic conferences and getting published. So you're being asked to do a lot of different projects, most of which involve writing, some of which may even be like departmental duties or obligations or things like that, teaching. And then instead of having a class and deadlines, most graduate writing projects are up to you to manage. So to set the deadlines, schedule meetings with your advisor, make sure that you are, making that progress towards the completion of the project, and then ultimately, of course, the program and to graduation. And this is something like a question that I get all the time is just like, okay, well, how do I do this? Like I've got this article that's coming up. I've got an R&R that I have to deal with. I really need to apply to this grant and I have the dissertation. Like, how am I supposed to do all of it at the same time? I don't know what to prioritize. Um, and a lot of that, it just kind of depends on the circumstances. The thing about things like teaching or grant applications is that there's an urgency to them. The papers have to get graded, grades have to be submitted. And so that tends to take priority. And then so perhaps your other writing projects get sidelined from that. And that is one of the more difficult things about the dissertation is that it's not always very urgent, right? These are projects that take a long time, and they're supposed to give you the time to really think and refine your arguments, and to present your research. So the general recommendation is to try to find ways to stay in touch with your dissertation while you are working on these other, oftentimes more urgent projects. And we can talk a little bit more later on how to do that. And then, of course, you still have rich, wonderful lives that you're leading. And I will just pause for a moment here, to acknowledge I've purposely tried to avoid talking about productivity. I've been doing some reading about, productivity as internalized capitalism and the ways in which, we are encouraged to tie our sense of self-worth to how much work we can do, and we can certainly talk about this too, and hopefully the conversation is shifting that your value is not necessarily determined by the number of pages you write a day or how many articles you publish, or even if you get an academic job, if that's what you want to pursue. And so I want this to be helpful in terms of how to develop healthy writing, or not healthy, but useful writing habits for you, but then also to think about the ways in which we can maintain or create a positive work-life balance, right? So that this doesn't, this work that you all are doing right now, and it is a job, right? Doesn't necessarily come to define how you think about yourself. And so I may not be saying this in the most elegant way possible, but I did want to acknowledge that that's very much part of the thinking behind this presentation. Okay, so some of the things that we can, or you might try to deal with these issues, to schedule your writing time as if it were a class or other non-negotiable commitment. So this can be difficult, but this is actually something that Caitlin is going to help us with in the second part of today's workshop. It's just finding the time and then scheduling it and then protecting it. We have things, making claims on our time and attention all the time, whether that be children or family or jobs or just things that we're interested in doing. It is really essential to have regularly recurring protected time to write. And so to that point, the second point here, it can be helpful to join a writing group because it kind of, that structure for protected writing time is created for you. We have writing groups here at the Writing Center. We have resources to help you set up your own writing groups if you want to do that with colleagues in your department or friends. But again, kind of creating a structure so that people show up and know what's going on, and can draw upon each other's energy and resources to sustain this work. As much as you can connect projects. You probably are presenting conference papers based on chapters and things, or publishing articles. So try to use your writing as much as possible. in potentially different ways, so chapters, conference papers, publications, talks. You could do the 3MT competition, which I don't know if you all know about, but it's the 3-minute thesis. It's actually a really handy way to practice a kind of pitch for your research and telling that story to different audiences. It's basically like a TED Talk for your graduate research, and it is a competition, and you can win a prize for it. The people that have participated in it before have told me that even just participating was incredibly helpful because it forced them to sit down and be like, okay, what is my research about? Why am I doing this? What kind of contribution to the scholarship and to the world do I really hope to make with this work? And so again, taking advantages of those opportunities if that helps. Mapping out projects well in advance. Last week we shared a handout on back planning, which encourages you to kind of establish timelines from the deadline back, so working with that deadline and then, scheduling out time as best you can estimate or predict that you need to meet those milestones towards that goal. Always a great idea to schedule check-ins with your advisor, and this doesn't necessarily have to be something like every Friday at 12 p.m. If you have that kind of advisor, great. But, knowing, if you want to submit a chapter draft, say like in October, it might be a good idea to schedule a check-in in like early September. Be like, here's how it's going. Here are the questions that I have. Here's some of the feedback or the kind of feedback that you could provide me with that would be really helpful. So the check-in, not necessarily always after the deadline, but before. Making appointments with the Writing Center. That's a plug for us, but of course, talking with someone about your work usually does good things, like having to verbalize your ideas or things that you might be struggling with. And then of course in the Writing Center, in the consultation, you will get feedback on those things, and having that conversation can help work through some blocks. And then lastly, scheduling time off from research, from writing, from life as a graduate student, and taking time for yourself. And again, being as vigilant in protecting that time off as you are in protecting your time to write. So rest is incredibly important. Okay. And then the last challenge that I'll talk about is trouble getting started. So without these firm deadlines that a lot of times are externally imposed, but instead here set by us, it can be difficult to find motivation. How do I get started? This seems impossible. It's too long. I'll do something else. The high stakes can make a project can seem daunting. The stakes are always different for different people. That you might be a first generation grad student who's doing this kind of work for the first time, and you feel like you need to live up to expectations from your family, or you really have your heart set on the academic job and you really want to write that kind of standout dissertation that will help you towards that goal, which leads oftentimes into feelings of perfectionism and then procrastination. This has to be a perfect project, it has to be that standout, but then also procrastination. Procrastination is actually like a very useful biological function. Like, we are designed to avoid the things that feel harmful or produce discomfort. And so procrastination is a way of doing that. Again, it's not a moral failure. You are not a bad graduate student or anything of the sort. You are trying to protect yourself. But there are some things that we can do to try to identify your procrastination triggers and some things that you might use to address them. So some general tips for getting started. Be generative, not perfect. Expect to write multiple messy drafts. So, not even professional writers can sit down at their computer and just dash something off that's perfectly composed and brilliant and evocative. It takes revision, and then it takes some more revision, and then it takes editing and reading and more revision. And so just knowing that and accepting it, I think can be really empowering. Um, Practice free writing and or brain drains. So free writing is just when you sit down and a lot of times people do this for a certain period of time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe even just 5 minutes, and you write whatever comes to mind. It can be stream of consciousness. It can be whatever comes to you, and you just get it down on the page. Brain drains is a term that I stole from someone named Julia Cameron. She wrote a very famous book called The Artist's Way, which is this kind of tools for how to unblock your creativity. And she calls these brain drains, she recommends doing that for creative types, writers, artists, painters, anybody who's making something, and you all are making the dissertation, so I thought this was appropriate to mention. She recommends starting every morning with a brain drain, setting aside 30 minutes or so to just write whatever comes to mind. And this does not have to be about your dissertation. This does not have to be about your research or your work at all. It's literally just kind of decluttering your brain to prepare you to do the kind of intellectually rigorous work of writing the dissertation or painting the portrait or whatever work you're doing. So that rather than kind of get stuck in our thoughts and have those kind of circular anxiety feelings or whatever happens to you, you just let it out, release it, and then go and do your work. Talking it out to a friend, to a pet, to a writing center consultant, like I was talking about, having a conversation, needing to verbalize your ideas, not only gets you doing that, but then if you can take a moment to reflect, I'm like, okay, how did I describe my project? Like, what were some of the key terms that I used there? Would I describe it differently to a different audience? And kind of paying attention to the things that recur. Like, okay, every time I talk about this chapter, I refer to that, or I mention this scholar. So I better deal with that scholar in a pretty substantial way. Drawing your argument, mind mapping, great visual practice in terms of kind of conceiving and mapping the relationship between ideas, between texts. I know a lot of people love the mind mapping for literature reviews, where you're kind of being asked to survey the conversation around your topics and be like, okay, this person's talking about this person's talking about that. Here's where they connect, here's where they diverge. And you literally, it just like circles and connecting lines. And you probably have all seen these before. I think I mentioned last week, just even post-it notes can do a similar type of thing. Post-it notes can be helpful in the revision process, where like you could write the topic of each paragraph on a post-it note and then put them up and then assess the organization. Like, do these things fit? And the nice thing about post-it notes is that they're movable elements. So if you're like, oh, actually, I talk about Chaucer here and then Chaucer again down here, it probably make more sense to talk about Chaucer in the same paragraph, or at least nearby paragraphs. And you can then move that piece. And then, that same process, I talk about revision, but also in brainstorming, just kind of putting things out there and then seeing how they fit together or don't fit together. And then lastly, set yourself up for success by making achievable concrete goals. So rather than saying something like, oh, I really just want to write every day, be like, okay, well, I'm going to try writing for 30 minutes every day. And see how that goes. Maybe that 30 minutes was incredibly painful and you want to scale back a little bit and just do 15 minutes a day. Or maybe you're like, wow, I was just getting started when that 30-minute mark hit. I'm going to try for an hour and see how that goes. Some people do well with word count goals or page goals. We talked a little bit last week about just doing the math, so say like you have a month to draft a chapter or 2 months to draft a chapter. The chapter needs to be 50 pages. Okay, well then divide that, and you get where I'm going with that. And just in terms of, okay, well then I should or can try to write this many number of pages a day. Some people that might be really stressful to do that, and then they don't want to quantify their thinking in that way. Again, what we want to do here is to just encourage you and kind of provide you with a forum to think about and reflect on what works for you. And if you don't know, that's totally okay. We are here to provide some options. All right, so the dissertation just doesn't happen, as you all know. If only it did, that would be amazing. But rather than waiting around for inspiration to strike or getting stuck in a shame spiral, and I can say a little bit more about the shame spiral, you can deploy a range of tools to help improve and focus your writing habits. So the shame spiral that I'm referring to, I don't know how people feel about this term, but the way that I've heard it used is, say you have a goal and you have a deadline, um, and then you don't meet that goal. You're like, oh man, I, went to my cousin's wedding and then I got sick and then I decided to research this other person and I just didn't make my goal. Well, then I better not go and talk to my advisor because I'm embarrassed. I don't have pages to show. And, I don't want to waste their time. So then you miss the meeting with your advisor. And then you probably see where this is happening, right? You miss the meeting with your advisor. And then more time goes by, and then you're reluctant to reach out to your advisor because you're very embarrassed about missing the meeting and the deadline from before, and then that's kind of where it goes off the tracks. So rather than do that, just really try to reflect on the process. And so the shame spiral too is again related to what we were talking about before. Is like if you don't meet those things, then a lot of times people are inclined to self-blame, like, oh, I'm just not very good at this. I'm not a very good graduate student. I'm just faking it. I don't deserve to be here, which are all really insidious thoughts that can derail our work. So rather than do that, hopefully you can reflect on the process and then make adjustments so that you can avoid it when you can. So dissertation project management, and it really is about project management. And so as you're writing your CV, think about, the dissertation as a project and the ways in which you are managing it in terms of setting deadlines and meeting goals and doing assessment and reflection. So it's not just about organizing your time, but about using it effectively and efficiently. Something you might try is to try logging your activities for a week. It's a long time, you could try, if that sounds like too much, you could try a day, just to figure out where you spend your time. I think typically we tend to underestimate the time that we spend doing certain things. I did try this activity at one point in time, and I thought I was on my phone reading the news for 10 minutes every morning. I was spending more like 45 doing it, and I was underestimating that time. So you have to, if you do this, be really scrupulous about it. Like there's I think an online tool called Toggle. Caitlin, have you heard of this, or has anyone else heard of this? It's like toggl.com. And I think it's free. I will need to check on that, but it helps you just kind of track your time.
I have not heard of it, but I will absolutely look into it right now and let you know if that's
Okay, great. And if you find something good, drop it into the chat.
great.
So just a means of identifying where you might be losing time or any recurring sources of distraction or diversion. And once you identify that, that's an opportunity then to, potentially make some changes or adjustments. So if you've been driving to campus or not driving, since most of us are still probably telecommuting, you might think about taking the bus, where if you can read or at least just kind of decompress a little bit and not have to deal with Austin traffic. Or if you know that you are or if you are vulnerable to TikTok time sucks, as it is incredibly good at doing, trying to set some time limits around that as well. Like, okay, like I'm gonna spend 10 minutes on TikTok and then I'm gonna turn it off and do something else. A little bit more about those procrastination triggers, and hopefully you guys get a laugh out of the cartoon. There are no limits to what you can accomplish when you're supposed to be doing something else, especially writing the dissertation. I've known a lot of people say things like, my house has never been so clean as when I was writing the dissertation, because rather than sit down and write, they clean the house. My own form of procrastination during grad school was cooking. I would make these really amazing, elaborate meals, and then have to clean up. And then I was tired from that activity and didn't always do the work or do the writing that I could have been doing. So procrastination triggers, some include drudgery, decisional ambiguity, and then existential threat. So what are those things? So the drudgery kind of names itself. It can be tedious. It can be a little bit boring, right? Especially if you're going over and reviewing material that you've been sitting with for quite a long time. Um, we kind of, I think, hopefully coming out of the pandemic, which is incredibly isolating, but then graduate school itself is isolating, and so is writing. Writing in terms of thinking and putting words on the page is not a social event. Even here at the Writing Center, we try to make it more social in terms of like writing retreats and writing groups, but it is still you and your computer, right? And so a lot of that can just create fatigue. So we avoid it. And decisional ambiguity, what I mean by that is a lot of times it's difficult to make decisions. Like the dissertation itself is a commitment. It's a project that you're going to be spending a lot of time on, potentially years. If you pursue the academic faculty tenure track position, it will become a book. So add more time to that. The high stakes that we talked about earlier. And so like, oh, what do I write about? Or like, what's the main concept or main argument? What are the texts? What are the materials? What are my processes? How do I do this? It's difficult to make these decisions. And then the existential threat relates back to, I think, what I mentioned about productivity being tied to feelings of self-worth, but then also perfectionism is that we feel like if we don't do a quote unquote good job at this, that is a reflection of who we are and what we're capable of doing. So, and this is reiterative of some of the things that I've talked about before, but I just want to really emphasize these points. So getting your thoughts down on paper to generate momentum, free writing, brain drains, mind map, notes, outlines, almost always writing or thinking happens through a process of writing, and so you can write your way to new good ideas and to find those points of insight. But if you kind of keep circling around in your head and delay and delay and delay actually getting to the page, sometimes those ideas are a little bit slower to develop. So start writing. Don't delay the writing. And by writing, I'm not saying this elegant, polished prose, these perfectly crafted sentences. I'm saying words on the page or phrases or quotes from your research, just something. To deal with decisional ambiguity, decide when to decide. Like, is this something you're struggling with, or like making a commitment to a certain set of materials? Set goal lines, set goals and deadlines for decision making itself, just as you would for a specific task. Like, okay, I'm going to decide this by then, and I'm going to do it. And then lastly, try as best you can to manage expectations. Last week, I asked you to think about, okay, well, really, what role do you want your dissertation to play in your professional development? And so if you know that you're going to pursue the academic path, have those next credentialing milestones in mind, but don't necessarily get hung up on them, because really what your task in front of you to do is to finish the dissertation and to graduate. And if you know that you're not going to pursue that path, and go on into different sectors, perhaps industry, kind of start setting yourself up for that now, and create the kind of project that's going to best serve you after graduation. Okay. So if you miss those deadlines, try not to be too hard on yourself, and reflect on process. So were there unexpected disruptions? Our lives have been full of those lately. They are full of those even under the best of circumstances. Do you think about your goals? Maybe you were a little ambitious. Maybe you said, okay, well, I'm traveling and I'm going to be going on vacation, but I can take my books with me to the beach. I mean, I can read Derrida while I'm, dipping my toe. You won't, so just make that a time of rest for yourself. And know what you need. And if you're going to the beach, you probably need rest, right? Shifting deadlines either from you or from advisors. This happens a lot. Sometimes an advisor will be like, okay, yeah, we can take a look at your chapter in December. And then they may come back and be like, oh, no, actually November would be better for me. And then you've just, lost a month. So you'll have to make that adjustment there. And it can be very difficult to do that. During the pandemic, especially, there could be issues of inadequate or inaccessible resources. Hopefully that is getting better. I'm not quite sure how the library is operating right now, but I feel confident that they're trying for 100% like occupancy and usability by the fall. Miscommunication with advisors happens all the time. Try to be as clear as possible in those communications, and to ask for and seek clarity when you need it. So rather than be like, I think she said December was okay, I'm just going to kind of operate on that logic. Just go ahead and ask. I think ultimately you'll make it easier for yourself, and just in terms of your own kind of like well-being, but then also in terms of demonstrating that kind of proactive project management. And then sometimes there's just some strategies that we may have tried that just didn't quite work. Maybe you were trying working outside the home and you found that to be stressful or distracting, or you thought like, oh, well, I don't need my whole collection of research and all these books in front of me every single time. And maybe you do, right? So those are some of the things that can affect our process. What doesn't work, no matter what, is self-trash talk and working yourself into a panic. Again, so self-trash talk being that like, I'm lousy, I'm not smart enough for this, I don't have anything to say, I'm a bad graduate student, etc. And then working yourself into a panic, oftentimes for very legitimate reasons, right? For, some of these things that I just talked about. But in terms of moving forward, it generally doesn't help us along. Caitlin, I'm seeing some chat things. Are people, anything we want to address now before I continue?
We had a few comments that were seconding your suggestion of using Toggle. And then I placed the link for Toggle in there for everyone as well. And we also had one suggestion that iPhones do a good job of tracking your time as well. So, right, I think just to sort of supplement that, it's important to I think for everyone to explore these different resources and find out what works really well for you and for your lifestyle, since
Yeah.
what works for me, what I might consider organization might give you a headache and
Yeah.
vice versa. So,
Yeah.
so really important to explore your own, your own path with these resources in mind.
It's so much of both published material and then just kind of like anecdotal. This is what worked for me is just like highly idiosyncratic. You know, I mean, there's the standard like, oh, we'll just treat it as a 9 to 5 job and you'll take it out in no time. Um, but not everyone's life works that way. So I think on exactly what Caitlin was just saying, there are so many apps out there that you can try. One that I have heard of is called Forest. And because we are constantly on our phones and they're literally designed to hold our attention, um, we might actually have to, download another app to block those claims on our attention. Forest is fun because you grow trees for as long as you don't touch your phone. And so if you stay focused and you see these little beautiful trees growing, and then guess what happens if you do touch your phone? They die or they wither away. And who wants to be a tree killer? No one, right? Like grow your forest. And I think on forest too, you can connect with other people. And so that's another thing too about accountability is that your work is visible to others. May not work for everyone, but if you need that kind of external accountability, even something like Forest can help with that. So Pomodoro is probably, I've mentioned it, we use it at the writing retreats. Pomodoro is just tomato in Italian. And that's right, Caitlin? You and so I have the tomato timer down there at the bottom. It's just timed writing sessions. And so the way that Pomodoro works for writing is that you have intervals and say you have 3 hours to work and you really want to focus and get some work done. Then you might try writing for 45 minutes and then taking a break for 15. And then you write for 45 minutes and you take a break for 15 and then write for 45 minutes and then take a break for 15. And you be vigilant on that timer. And so like if that timer, your phone or whatever goes off at the 45 and you are in the middle of this beautiful sentence, you still stop. You stop what you're doing and you go and you take your break. But this also means that you don't look at your phone, you don't go make a snack, you don't watch that funny video on YouTube during those 45 minutes. I often compare it to like high interval intensity training that you guys or many people may have done at the gym, where the whole logic is like, okay, you really focus, you do this kind of high intensity work, knowing that you will get that scheduled break. You know that after 45 minutes, you can go and get a snack and you can touch your phone and you can check your email or you can listen to that or like change your Spotify. But that you hold off on doing those things until your break. That is really, it's a great way to break up longer chunks of time. And I think almost always people have said like, oh, wow, those 3 hours went by in a flash. Because there's something really good happens like at the kind of psychological level when you know you're going to have a break. Like you can do anything. And even 45 minutes might be too long. Maybe you want to try like 30 minutes of writing and then a 10-minute break, or 30 minutes of writing and a 30-minute break. You can make whatever adjustments you like. Organization, so many apps. Evernote is a popular one. Research management, Zotero is a free one. And there are also, excuse me, workshops offered by the library on how to use Zotero. We even have a YouTube tutorial by our colleague Jamie Gardner that's published on how to use Zotero. It's very popular and it's free, and it's very useful. Scrivener is not free, but people also like that. I believe the last time I checked it was about $50 or so, and you download it to your computer or to your tablet or device. And it helps organize your notes, and then it can take notes and can put them into a Word doc. And it's all searchable too. So rather than kind of slogging through lots of pages of handwritten notes looking for who said what on what page of your research, it's in this system for you. Um, Anyone want to throw into the chat any other apps that they like? Or you just even unmute yourself, that's fine too. Okay, well, we'll get to that later.
As the answers start trickling in, I'll stop you and add those back in.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin.
Sure.
So getting towards the wrap up here, make choices about time allocation. Be reflective. If you know you are not a morning person and you are not operating at full capacity, you're probably not going to want to schedule writing time in the morning. So maybe later in the afternoon or in the evening. As best you can, try to avoid jumping back and forth between tasks in a single work session. This is also something I used to do to procrastinate, so like I'd be trying to draft a certain section of my chapter and be like, oh gosh, I just don't want to do this anymore. And I would jump over to my bibliography and start fiddling with the format. That has to get done. Like the bibliography needs to be formatted and needs to be done well. But in that moment, it was a form of procrastination. The biggest one that I hear about is just doing more research and continuing to go down that research rabbit hole. Again, great. It can be very useful to really know the conversation around your topic and in your field and discipline. But if you are doing it in such a way where you delay and delay and delay the writing, it may be that you are using it to procrastinate. So just kind of try to check in with that. Test paces and conditions for writing. So music, silence, internet on or off, working in the company of others or totally by yourself. I've heard people really like those. They're like blue light glasses that block light from your computer screens just to take it a little bit easier on your eyes. Finding that great pair of headphones. So rather than using like the earbuds that the iPhone may give you with your phone, like getting ones that are really comfortable and feel good if you like listening to music or want to cancel out noise with headphones. If you can, arrange a writing space in your home. We may not all have the space to do that, but you can. And if you can, try to make it that space sacred. So maybe not eating in your writing space, or not writing in bed, right? Or again, just dedicated spaces to do particular things. And then, even just making it aesthetically pleasing for yourself. Like if you want things up that you like looking at, or setting your table up in front of a window, or not allowing pets or children or partners to crowd you in that space as much as you can. And then lastly, of course, making time for people and activities that bring you joy, balance, and connection, and taking a day off of work from the dissertation if possible. Yeah, do it. You need it.
Kristin, we did have a couple of notes for some apps.
Oh, great.
And I wanted to add too about arranging a writing space in your home, because that, I don't know if everyone is like me, where that's been a particularly difficult, contentious area since we've all been relegated to our homes. I'm one of those people who mentally sort of blocks off certain kinds of work for certain kinds of spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So I've really had to draw firm boundaries in my mind of now these boundaries inside of our home, the lines are blurred between kitchen and bedroom and whatever the important spaces in your home are. And so that's something personally I've been working on in a moment of vulnerability to share with you all. That's been something that, yeah, particularly has been a challenge. So Marcelino suggested an app called Roam, which I'm not specifically familiar with, and my computer tends to have a meltdown if I'm on Zoom and trying to look up stuff at the same time. So I encourage either Marcelino, if you'd like to say a word about it to us, but not to put you on the spot. You can also explain it through the chat if you'd like to. And then we've got Heather, who suggested EndNote for desktop, which is not free. However, it looks like we might have access to that through UT. Alina suggested that she bought Scrivener, and it's definitely worth the investment. And then that an app called Trello has been really useful for to-dos and organization. And then Michael just added to the discussion that there is a link here that he gave us in the chat that is an extension for Pomodoro for Chrome. And that allows you to set your own schedules with a certain intervals of writing and break cycle. Great. Thanks, everyone, very much for contributing.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So I'm going to finish up here. Just some recaps of approaches and practices. You all know well by now that the expectations for your writing projects as a graduate student are different. So plan accordingly. Plan is the key word there, right? Research your audience, find examples and make templates. So not just for the dissertation, but the other genres of graduate writing that you're doing. Don't wait for magical writing time or inspiration to strike. I hate to say it, but it probably won't. Maybe it will if you're really lucky. But I think just making a routine is really where things happen. Be generative, not perfect, and define what generative means to you, right? In terms of am I feeling generative? Am I feeling good if I write this number of pages or this number of words? Or is a good day for me having a good conversation with my advisor and then playing with my dog? Like figure out what it is for you and then make a plan to help you meet these goals, and then experiment. There's lots out there. Don't let that become a form of procrastination, though, like trying every distraction blocker there is out on the market. But maybe just get some recommendations as we've been doing here, so other people have vetted things, take their recommendations and try it out. Okay. So we are about 5 minutes from the top of the hour. I think this might be a great time to take a very quick break. And then the second part of today's workshop, as I mentioned before, Caitlin will be facilitating a discussion and then some activities. And why don't we rejoin this room at 2 o'clock? All right. Thanks so much, everyone.